When the Second World War ended in 1945, the machinery of the Third Reich collapsed with German surrender. The SS soldiers, one of the most feared organizations of the Nazi regime, faced different destinies. Some were captured and judged, others disappeared for decades, while a small group reintegrated into society with false identities. However, the fall of the Reich did not mean the end of its legacy, nor did it prevent many perpetrators from evading justice over the years. The Allies, the Crazy, and various intelligence agencies undertook a global hunt for those responsible for the Holocaust and other war crimes. From the Nuremberg Trials to secret missions in South America and the Middle East, the persecution lasted for more than 7 decades. How were Nazi war criminals persecuted? And what was their music destiny? The Reich in Ruins, the road to defeat. At the end of 1944, both the Axis and the Allies understood that the balance of the war was tilting against Nazi Germany. What was once a solid regime began to crumble rapidly. Hitler lost control of his troops, and conspiracies arose within his oon circle. Operation Valkyrie, designed as an emergency mechanism to guarantee continuity of command in case of extreme crisis, became an assassination attempt against Hitler by high-ranking officers. His elimination was key to executing the coup and allowing the army to free itself from its oath of allegiance to the Führer. However, the conspiracy failed, keeping Hitler in power until the total collapse in 1945. While the British and Americans advanced in the liberation of France, Soviet troops began their final offensive from the east. At the beginning of 1945, they were rapidly approaching the German capital. High-ranking Nazi commanders entered and left the Führer bunker, unable to find an effective way to stop the bloody defeat of their forces. The relentless bombings forced several cities to capitulate, making clear that Hitler's dream of absolute domination was crumbling. Berlin, symbol of the regime, became the epicenter of the battle. Refugee in his underground fortress, Hitler began to disconnect completely from reality. In charge of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels kept him in a bubble of illusions with fictitious reports of non-existent victories, while Soviet artillery resonated a short distance away. The civilian population faced a devastating scenario. Basic supplies were insufficient, infrastructures were in ruins, and the majority sought refuge in bunkers or fled to rural areas. The regional leaders of the Nazi Party, in an act of denial, clung to power, imposing brutal measures against those who tried to desert or showed discontent. Even within the Nazi leadership, fragmentation was evident. On April 23rd, Hermann Göring sent a message to Hitler proposing to assume the leadership, which unleashed the fury of the dictator Hitler, who accused him of treason. Without another alternative, Göring fled south, hoping to negotiate surrender with the Allies. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, tried to reach a secret agreement with the Western powers, but was captured and detained, where he ended his days as a prisoner during the first hours of April 29th with his destiny sealed. Hitler married Eva Braun and left his last will in writing. The alarming news about the imminent arrival of Soviet troops to the bunker did not cease at 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th. A strong detonation shook the underground refuge. The SS soldiers entered Führer's office and found Hitler and Eva lifeless. His closest followers, following precise orders, made sure that the bodies were incinerated to prevent the Allied armies from capturing them. And so it happened. They were never found. The announcement of Hitler's death plunged Germany into absolute chaos. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda decided to follow the same destiny and were not the only ones. Before doing so, they made sure that their 6 children were never captured by the enemy. On May 2nd, when Berlin was already completely besieged, Soviet soldiers took the Reichstag building and raised the red flag at the top. At that moment, Nazi rule ceased to exist in practice, despite the fall of the capital. The clashes in various parts of Germany continued for a few more days. Finally, on May 7th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had assumed the leadership of the Reich after Hitler's death, signed the unconditional surrender, sealing the end of the war in Europe. However, peace did not come immediately. At that moment, the Allies began an intense persecution to capture and judge the perpetrators of the Nazi regime, who were trying to disappear and escape as far as possible from Germany. Some of Hitler's closest collaborators, such as Martin Bormann, Heinrich Himmler, and Robert Ley, preferred to disappear rather than face a trial in Nuremberg. Others decided to surrender, hoping to obtain clemency. Hermann Göring, who had been arrested for planning a coup against Hitler, was released on May 5th after being rescued by a Luftwaffe unit. Then, he went directly to the American lines to surrender, trusting that the treatment with the Americans would be more lenient than with the Soviets. This decision probably allowed him to stay alive, since the Red Army did not usually show mercy to the Nazi officers who fell into their hands. The persecution of the Nazis on the European continent before the Second World War ended had already been planned by the Allied powers, who had designed a plan to judge those responsible for the Nazi regime in an international court. This implied not only arresting the largest possible number of officers and officials of the Third Reich, but also getting key witnesses who could testify against them. Among them were, of course, the wives of some of the high officials. Gerda, wife of Martin Bormann, tried to escape from Germany with her 9 children amid the chaos caused by the entry of Soviet troops into Berlin. She pretended to be the director of an orphanage and dressed some children as orphans. With this false identity, she managed to board a school bus and cross the border into Italy, where she found refuge in South Tyrol. There she was received by a local leader of a Nazi party, who provided her with a hiding place and took care to protect the confidential documents she was carrying. Finally, the family settled in a small town about 50 kilometers from Bolzano. Despite having temporarily avoided capture, Gerda's health rapidly deteriorated due to throat cancer, requiring an urgent operation. However, her location did not go unnoticed. Allied intelligence agents located her and notified British forces in the area. A local doctor, when questioned, informed them about her health and location. Shortly after, a British officer appeared at her residence. Frightened, she believed that they would send her to a prison camp, but the officer assured her that she was not in danger. Instead of being arrested, she was transferred to a military hospital in Murano. Despite the surgical intervention, her condition did not improve, and she died on March 23, 1946, months before turning 37. Some low-ranking members of the Nazi regime realized that their only option to survive was to cooperate with the victors and decided to collaborate with the Office of Strategic Services of the United States, OSS, the future CIA. A representative case was that of Wilhelm Hodel, who had been commander of the SS in Austria and held a doctorate in history. He spent most of his career working as an agent for both the security police and the SS. When the war was coming to an end, Lee understood that the German defeat was inevitable, so he made several trips to Switzerland to meet with the head of the OSS station in Bern in order to win the favor of the Americans by offering them information about the military plans of the Axis for a last defense in the Alps and about the gold reserves hidden in the Austrian mountains. However, events moved quickly, and before an agreement could be reached, Soviet troops were already near Berlin in May 1945. He tried to cross into Switzerland, but the presence of French troops on the border stopped him. Detained in Landeck, he chose to return to Austria in search of a safe place. Finally, that same month, he surrendered to American forces in Bad Gastein. He was later transferred to Germany and, in October 1947, sent to Lerchenfeld in Salzburg. During this time, Hodel became a key witness in the Nuremberg Trials, providing relevant information for the prosecution. In December 1947, he was released as part of an agreement with American intelligence services, after which he began to collaborate with them in espionage tasks against the Communist Party of Austria. In the following years, in addition to continuing his work in intelligence, he dedicated himself to writing and published several books. Not all members of the Nazi regime managed to evade justice. Rudolf Haas, known for directing the Auschwitz concentration camp and responsible for the deaths of more than 1.5 million Jews, managed to remain hidden for almost 5 months after the fall of the Third Reich. To avoid discovery, he adopted a false identity and established himself as a farmer in a rural area of northern Germany, near the border with Denmark. His capture occurred when American forces first detained his wife. During the interrogation, she provided the information that led to his location. 2 army units surrounded the farm where he was hiding and found him completely unprepared, still in his sleeping clothes. After his arrest, he was transferred to Auschwitz, where he served his sentence a short distance from the house where he had lived with his family until 1945. His execution was carried out on July 3, 1946, within the framework of the Fugitives of the Reich operation organized by the Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army. Intelligence Corps of the United States Army to the President, in which it was stated that the Nazis had designed escape routes since at least 1944. This strategy was called Odessa, acronym for Organization of Former Members of the SS. To date, there is no certainty as to whether it was a coordinated effort by the Nazi government or a series of independent plans executed by different groups within the regime. However, what is certain is that these routes allowed many Nazis to leave the country undetected with surprising success. In Argentina alone, it is estimated that at least 300 people from the Third Reich took refuge, with others finding asylum in countries including Brazil, Paraguay, and some in the Middle East. In total, some 10,000 people linked to the Nazi Party left Germany before the end of 1945. Some historians have pointed to the participation of institutions such as the Red Cross, the Vatican, and even the United States Army in this mass exodus. However, in the midst of the post-war devastation, controlling each exit from the country proved to be an almost impossible task. To evade the authorities, many fugitives resorted to false identities, posed as displaced persons, or sought help from various organizations. It was not until years later that the CIA, Mossad, and MI5 took concrete measures to locate, identify, and arrest these criminals in various parts of the world. The immediate priority after the conflict was stabilizing the region and rebuilding what remained of Germany. Whether Odessa existed as an organized structure or only in the minds of American intelligence agents, the networks that helped thousands of Nazis escape were an undeniable reality in the early years after the war. It is estimated that around 90% of the fugitives escaped through the Alps to Italy, similarly to what Goethe Bormann did. The first destination was often the South Tyrol region in northern Italy. There, many Nazis found temporary refuge in Catholic monasteries, including the Order of the Teutonic Knights in Murano, the Capuchins near Bressanone, and the Franciscans in the vicinity of Bolzano. This escape route was known as the Route of the Monasteries, contributing to the myth that the Vatican and Pope Pius XII played a key role in protecting war criminals. It was not a far-fetched idea, since it was well known that Pius XII considered communism the greatest threat to the Church and Western world. In South Tyrol, priests provided documents that confirmed the identity of the fugitives, although the information was completely false. These documents allowed the fugitives to obtain Red Cross passports without much scrutiny. Between 1945 and 1951, at least 120,000 of these documents were issued, but long before the decade ended, the U.S. authorities were already aware of what was happening. In 1946, after a massive escape from a prisoner of war camp in Ronny, U.S. soldiers discovered that former SS officers were hiding in local monasteries and obtaining travel documents issued by the Red Cross. Even before those events, after the arrival of U.S. troops in Roma, some Georgian clerics obtained authorization from the Pope to establish a seminary in the city. A few months later, the Allied authorities began to notice an unusual fact. Several of the seminarians seemed to maintain sentimental relationships. After a thorough inspection, it was discovered that the place served as refuge for SS officers who had installed an advanced radio station in the basement. When examining the involvement of the Vaticano in the protection of Nazi criminals, the name of Alois Hudel stands out. This Austrian bishop openly expressed his affinity for the Hitler regime and later justified his actions, claiming many of the persecuted were innocent. He argued that providing them with false documents was the right decision. However, the most accessible and convenient destination for the flight of the Nazis was Spain, governed at that time by General Francisco Franco. Due to the lack of precise official records, it is difficult to determine how many former Nazi regime members found refuge there. However, the appearance of numerous neo-Nazi groups in the country in the following decades suggests there were several thousand. One of the most famous refugees was Leon de Grelle, commander of the Walloon SS. From his hiding place in Malaga, he spoke repeatedly without being tried for his war crimes. However, in the 1980s, he faced charges related to denying the Holocaust. Heiler, the silent network of the SS. Unlike Odessa, there was another group called Stiller Hele or Silent Help, which operated in Alemania and other countries after the Second World War. Its objective was to support former SS members who had been arrested, convicted, or were fugitives. They provided them with legal assistance, provided them with resources, and, in many cases, helped them hide or escape. Through this network, hundreds, even thousands of Nazis managed to flee to South America and Orient Medio. In 1951, Stille Hilfe acquired legal status as a nonprofit, which allowed it to receive funding through donations. Its founding act took place in Munich, a city that 3 decades earlier had been the cradle of the Nazi Party. From the beginning of the Nuremberg Trials, the group tried to influence public opinion to avoid death sentences. They used campaigns in the media, personal and collective letters, as well as various petitions to present the accused as victims. The legal representation of the detainees was carried out by Rudolf Asche, who also managed the request for clemency and the appeals against the sentences. The organization promoted benefits, such as permits to leave prison, financial compensation, and aid to the families of the prisoners. They did not limit themselves to providing humanitarian support, but also promoted revisionist activities, organizing meetings, and sending demands to authorities. However, one of their most secretive actions was directly aiding the evasion of Nazi criminals. One beneficiary of this network was Johann von Lees, a prominent member of the Waffen-SS and a relevant editor within the Ministry of Propaganda. After the war, he escaped to Italia and lived there for 5 years. In 1950, he moved to Argentina, where he continued his ideological work. During this time, he collaborated with Der Weg, a Nazi-leaning publication founded in Buenos Aires in 1947. His position earned him recognition from Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who praised him for supporting Arab nationalism. This relationship influenced his decision to convert to Islam and settle in Egypto, where he served as an advisor to the government of Abdel Nasser in the drafting of propaganda materials. Another person who managed to escape with the support of Stiller Hele was Eric Piquet, whose name is remembered for his participation in the mass execution of civilians in the Tyne Caves near Rome on March 24, 1944. More than 330 people were taken to that place, with their hands tied, and listened to how they were called by name before being led in groups of 5 to the cave. Piquet, who supervised the procedure, used an Italian machine gun to kill 2 victims. The massacre ended before nightfall, and then access to the caves was sealed with explosives. Unlike other Nazis who took refuge in Italia, he decided to go to Lvivia before boarding a ship bound for Argentina, where he settled in Barilla under the identity of Otto Paper. For almost 50 years, he remained anonymous until he was discovered and extradited to Italia in 1995. 3 years later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and spent his last days under house arrest until his death on October 11, 2013. Walter Roth designed the MAB mobile gas chambers, in which toxic engine gases were channeled into the rear compartment of modified trucks. According to the report of his capture, he is credited with the deaths of at least 97,000 people. In 1949, he escaped with his wife and children, following a clandestine route that first took him to Quito, Ecuador, and then to Chile. In 1963, West Germany requested his extradition, but Chilean authorities rejected the request, arguing that the crimes he was accused of had prescribed according to local legislation in Chilean territory. He prospered economically in the food industry and died of a heart attack on May 14, 1984. Francia strangled the former SS commander and key figure in the T4 euthanasia program, who worked for Volkswagen Brazil for 16 years before being arrested in 1967. Before his capture, He supervised the extermination centers where hundreds of thousands lost their lives. He stood out for his absolute indifference and lack of remorse, which facilitated his work in the Treblinka, Sobibor, and Trias camps. Once arrested, he was tried, but died of a heart attack in 1971 before receiving his sentence. Joseph Mengele, from Eitz, went underground along with other lower-ranking members of the Nazi regime. His capture wasn't a priority because the cost of locating them outweighed the gravity of their crimes. However, in cases like Josep Mengele's, his atrocities were so indescribable that no effort seemed too much if it led to his life imprisonment. During the war, his name was not among the most recognized, but after the conflict, his crimes came to light, revealing his brutality. Only then did the Allies discover the extent of his sadism. Executed under the pretext of scientific research, his role in Eitz was decisive, since he decided who would be sent directly to the gas chamber and who would temporarily retain their life. Mengele considered the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and children expendable, while those in better physical condition could be used in his experiments. These prisoners were forced to undress, their heads shaved, and then they were transferred to the hospital to be subjected to his studies. His main obsession was what he called racial hygiene, a pseudoscientific doctrine that sought to justify the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. His experiments with twins are sadly famous. He subjected them to interventions without anesthesia, amputated healthy limbs, introduced viruses into their bodies, and deliberately caused infections in their wounds. He sought to analyze how the bodies of those he considered inferior responded to pain, disease, and extreme stress. Upon learning of Hitler's death, Mengele joined a group of German soldiers heading to Bavaria under U.S. control. Unarmed and disoriented, they were arrested and taken to the Schönstein prisoner of war camp, about 120 kilometers from Nuremberg. There, Mengele met with Dr. Kyer, an old acquaintance since the U.S. soldiers did not know his true identity, and he introduced himself as Joseph Mengele. They managed to deceive their captors. In addition, he avoided being identified as a member of the SS, since he never allowed his blood type to be tattooed on his arm, something common among officers of that unit. Thanks to this, he and Kalo were released, considered simple doctors without serious records. After his release, Mengele went to Eitz with the intention of recovering his notes, which he considered valuable. Then he managed to escape by crossing the southern border into Italy, where he arrived in Genoa in 1949. There, he obtained a Red Cross passport in the name of Helmut Greger. In July of that year, he set sail for Argentina and settled in Vicente Lopez. During his stay in the South American country, he worked first as a carpenter and later selling agricultural machinery. Convinced that no one was looking for him, he used his real name without fear. However, in 1958, he was interrogated along with other doctors suspected of practicing medicine without authorization after a young woman's death during an abortion. No charges were filed against him, but this made him reflect on the danger of being identified. To avoid a possible capture, he decided to move to Paraguay, where in 1959 he obtained citizenship under the name of José Mengele. The name appeared several times during the Nuremberg trial in the second half of the 1940s, but the Allies assumed that he had probably died. It was not until the 1960s that the Mossad began its search with the intention of capturing him and bringing him to Israeli justice. The investigations carried out in Paraguay did not yield clear indications of his whereabouts. In addition, attempts to track his correspondence with Martha, his wife residing in Italy, were unsuccessful. The undercover agents sent to South America managed to reach a rural area on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, where they identified a European man who could have been Mongol. However, due to the lack of absolute certainty, the Mossad decided to halt the operation in 1962. This decision allowed one of the most infamous Nazi criminals, known as the Angel of Death, to spend the rest of his days peacefully in southern Brazil. In 1979, while swimming, he suffered a stroke and drowned. Klaus Barbie, the protection of a Nazi butcher when the Germans took control of France, Klaus Barb, an SS intelligence officer, was initially sent to Jong. Shortly after, he was transferred to Lyon, where he established his base of operations at the Terminus Hotel. There he subjected prisoners, both adults and children, to brutal torture sessions. In addition, he trained German Shepherd dogs to attack detainees indiscriminately. His ruthless behavior earned him the nickname Butcher of Lyon. It is estimated that he was directly responsible for the deaths of 14,000 people in French territory. After the end of the war, the French provisional government sentenced him to death in absentia, since his whereabouts were unknown. It was later discovered that he was in the custody of U.S. forces, which led France to request his extradition. However, instead of complying with the request, the Americans helped him escape to Bolivia, where he spent the next 3 decades with a new identity, Klaus Altmann. There he collaborated with the United States Counterintelligence Corps, which at that time sought to curb the expansion of communism in Latin America. Barbie also maintained close ties with the military governments of Bolivia and Peru, where he ensured he contributed to the persecution of Guevara in 1971. During a visit to Peru, his true identity was discovered by French groups dedicated to locating fugitive Nazis, but due to the lack of an extradition agreement between France and Bolivia, he remained safe. A year later, a journalist traveled to La Paz to interview him. When asked if he was the German war criminal, he vehemently denied any connection with that name. Even when shown photographs of victims who had suffered under his command, he insisted that he did not recognize anyone. However, when returning the photographs, he left his fingerprints, which made it possible to confirm his true identity. Despite this, the Bolivian government continued to reject the extradition. The situation changed when a new democratic government took power and allowed his arrest. Subsequently, he was sent to France to face trial. In 1984, he was tried for the atrocities committed during his term as head of the Gusto in Lyon between 1942 and 1944. Among his worst crimes was the raid in Rue S. Catherine, when he ordered the capture of 86 Jews who were sent to extermination camps. To carry out the operation, he chose a Tuesday, since on that day, a Jewish federation offered help and free food. First, he detained the workers there and then arrested each person who entered the building. None returned to their house. The victims were deported to Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Only 3 survived. On July 4, 1987, Klaus Barbie was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. 4 years later, at age 77, he died in a prison in Lyon due to leukemia and cancer of the spine and prostate. Barbie and Wilhelm Huddle were part of a small group of Nazi criminals recruited by American agencies, such as the Counterintelligence Corps. Another collaborator was Robert Jan Verlyn, a member of the Flemish SS responsible for at least 101 murders in Belgium during the war. Verlyn, in addition to ordering executions, carried out grenade attacks on bars and cafes. In 1946, American authorities hired him in Austria to work on Project Newton, whose objective was to infiltrate. In 1959, he obtained Austrian citizenship, but in 1965, he faced trial for war crimes. Despite the evidence, he was acquitted and lived freely until his death in 1990. The case of Verlyn revealed 2 realities. First, that the United States government did not always prioritize the prosecution of Nazi criminals. Second, that if Israeli Jews wanted these individuals to face justice, they would have to take matters into their own hands. Herbert Kurz, The Fall of a Murderer during the 1960s. Israel decided to take justice into its own hands without resorting to international courts. The Foreign Intelligence Service of Israel, known as the Mossad, was given the mission of locating and eliminating Herbert's cooker. This man, nicknamed the Butcher of WWII, was involved in the execution of at least 30,000 Jews in Latakia. His elimination, whose authorship was never officially recognized by Israel, aimed to expose his atrocities and demonstrate that Nazi criminals would not go unpunished. It also served as a warning to those who were still unidentified before the conflict. Cooker was a respected figure in Latakia. He was compared to Charles Lindbergh for his achievements in aviation. In 1933, he piloted a plane that he himself had assembled and traveled the distance between Latakia and the British colony of Gambia. At the end of 1939, he made another long-distance trip, this time to Palestine. Everything changed when, in 1940, the country fell under Soviet control after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A year later, the German invasion of the USSR brought Nazi rule to Latvia. For some, the Germans represented hope against Soviet repression, but for the Jewish population, they meant a mortal threat. In Riga, the Nazis established a system of persecution and extermination in which Kerr stood out as one of the most cruel. During the occupation, he became the right hand of the Commando Erich Group, a paramilitary force composed of 300 Latvians who persecuted and murdered thousands of Jews. The organization's brutality was extreme. They shot indiscriminately in the streets, killed for fun, and looted their victims. There are records that link Quaz with the Rumbula massacre, which took place between November 30th and December 8th, 1941, in which approximately 25,000 people were executed near the forest of the same name. At the end of the war, like many Nazi criminals, he escaped to South America. Unlike other fugitives, he did not change his identity. He arrived in Brazil using his real name and began to associate with members of the local Jewish community. He presented himself as a political refugee who supposedly had saved Jews during the Holocaust, a lie that some believed for a time. However, as the years passed, his story was disproved, and his past caught up with him. His egocentric character led to his downfall, since he never tried to hide his public statements, and his proximity to the Jewish community caught the attention of the Mossad, which soon located him. Although it was initially expected that he would be tried in Germany, this never happened. In 1965, Mossad agents devised a plan to trap him. An undercover agent of the MAD convinced Kuss to travel to Uruguay with the promise of starting an aviation-related business. The offer seemed too good to refuse, which led Kurz to accept without hesitation. His contact, who introduced himself as Anton Kungla, was actually Yakov Mad, a veteran of the MAD known for his participation in the capture of Adolf Eichen in Argentina in 1960. In mid-1965, Mayad sent him a telegram from Montevideo inviting him to a house recently rented by a supposed Viennese businessman in a remote area. When Kukas crossed the threshold, a group of men surprised him. Latin tried to resist with all his might, even biting one of the attackers so hard that he almost tore off a finger. However, the fight ended when one of the attackers hit him on the head with a hammer, leaving him helpless. At that moment, Kurz begged to be allowed to speak before they made a decision about his fate. No one responded to his plea. 2 shots to the head from a silenced pistol ended his life instantly. The body was discovered inside a trunk on March 6th. He had multiple bullet wounds, and the bone structure of his skull was destroyed. Next to the body were documents linking him to the massacre of the Riga ghetto, Adolf Eichen, the mission that changed justice. Capturing Adolf Eichen turned out to be much more complicated than arresting Kuss. He managed to hide his tracks, while fleeing to Argentina. But, in the end, his behavior gave him away. Born in Singan in 1906, he became a high-ranking SS officer when World War II broke out and fulfilled his role with absolute dedication during the last years of the conflict. His main responsibility was organizing the mass deportation of Jews to the extermination camps and designing the strategy for the genocide in Europe after the Wannsee Conference agreements in 1942. Although he rarely set foot in the concentration camps, his role was key in the execution of the Holocaust, making him responsible for millions of deaths. On December 24, 1944, Eichen left Budapest just before the Soviets managed to surround the city. He returned from Berlin, where he was in charge of destroying documentary evidence of his activities. Like many other SS members who were escaping in the last days of the Reich, Eichmann took refuge in Austria with his family after the German surrender on May 8, 1945. However, at the end of the war, American troops arrested him, and he spent some time detained in several camps for Nazi officers, posing as a man named Otto M. thanks to false documents. Realizing that his true identity was in danger of discovery, he escaped from a labor camp in Cham, Germany. By then, Rudolf Herr, the former commander of AIDS, had already pointed him out in the Nuremberg Trials as the mastermind of the Holocaust. Ackman understood that he had to disappear completely. In 1948, he obtained false documents to emigrate to Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement, thanks to a support network led by Bishop Alois Hudel. Following the so-called route of the monasteries, arriving in Italy, from where he managed to reach South America. Finally, he settled in AOS, a neighborhood of Buenos Aires, and adopted a discreet lifestyle. He found employment at the Mercedes-Benz factory and rose to head of department. Shortly after, his wife and children joined him. One of his sons, Clues, began a relationship with Sylvia, a young German woman whose father had survived the Dachau concentration camp, unaware that the girl had Jewish ancestry. Klaus made offensive comments suggesting that the Nazis had not finished their job of exterminating certain groups. Such as is expected, the relationship did not last. The following year, Sylvia's father heard testimony during a war crimes trial in Frankfurt, in which Adolf Ackman was mentioned as a key figure in the extermination of the Jewish people. Upon hearing that last name, he remembered that it matched that of his. Without delay, he communicated his suspicions to prosecutor Fritz Bauer in Frankfurt. Bauer demanded more details, especially the exact location of the man who could be Ackman. However, Sylvia's father had a great obstacle. The brutal beatings he had suffered in Dachau in the 1930s had left him blind. Therefore, Sylvia decided to investigate on her own in Olivos. After some inquiries, she obtained an address, Chabuk 4261. One Sunday afternoon, she went to the residence and knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was Vera Amon, Klaus's wife, who told her that Klaus was not at home. However, she invited her in for coffee and pastries. Sylvia accepted the hospitality and, shortly after, a man joined the conversation. When she asked if he was Klaus's father, the man flatly denied it, claiming he was only his uncle. Minutes later, House appeared in the kitchen and, upon seeing Sylvia, was visibly surprised. Immediately, he ordered her to leave the house. Ackman accompanied them to the exit, and before saying goodbye, Klaus mentioned that he would take Sylvia to catch the bus. His supposed uncle suggested that it would be more appropriate to accompany her home, to which Klaus responded with a phrase that sealed the fate of Ackman. "Thank you, Father. I will make sure she gets home safe and sound." That confirmation allowed Sylvia and her father to inform Prosecutor Bauer that the architect of the final solution was living openly in a neighborhood of Buenos Aires. However, the only difficulty was that, although the testimony was shocking, Bauer considered it insufficient to justify a large-scale operation outside Germany. Simon Wienel, the legacy of the Nazi hunt. Fortunately, there was someone who did not give up easily. Simon Wienel, a Holocaust survivor who spent almost 3 years imprisoned in Yanova, then in Krav Plav, and finally survived a death march to Mauthausen. After living those atrocious experiences, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to locating Nazi criminals. In 1953, a letter revealed to him that Ackman had been seen in Buenos Aires. The following year, he took that information to the Israeli consulate in Vienna. Then, in 1960, after Amon's father's death, he organized private detectives to photograph the fugitive's relatives. It was known that his brother Otto looked a lot like him, and there were no recent images of the former SS officer. On February 18th, Wintel delivered those photographs to the MAD agents. Thanks to that material, they were able to verify his identity in Argentina. Since Argentina had a history of rejecting Nazi extraditions, requesting it would have been useless, so Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion ordered his capture and transfer to Israel to be tried. In April 1960, a group of 8 agents traveled to Buenos Aires with that mission. On May 11th of that year, Ackman was intercepted near his home on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando. For weeks, the agents had observed his movements and discovered he took the same bus every night. However, on the appointed day, he did not appear on the usual transport. This almost frustrated the plan. Finally, he arrived on another bus half an hour later. Peter Malin, an agent of MAD, approached him and spoke to him in Spanish, asking to ask him a question. Ackman, surprised, tried to escape, but 2 more agents restrained him. He fought with them until they subdued him and put him in a car, covering him with a blanket. They took him to a Mossad safe house, where he remained for 9 days. There, further verifications were carried out to confirm his identity. Finally, on the night of May 20th, Yonah Ellen, an anesthetist on the team, sedated him and disguised him as a flight attendant to get him out of the country on an Israeli plane. Upon arriving in Israel, he was held in a fortified police station in Yaga for 9 months. During that time, he was subjected to daily interrogations until his trial began on April 11th, 1961. He was charged with 15 counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and membership in a criminal organization. Shortly after midnight on June 1st, 1962, Eichen was executed in Ramler prison. Meanwhile, Wienel was recognized as a hero in his country. In the following years, Bethel continued his relentless pursuit of Nazi criminals through various methods. He founded the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Austria, where he collected information on war criminals and offered assistance to displaced persons. He dedicated himself to meticulously recording the horrors of the Holocaust, interviewing witnesses, and using the media to keep alive interest in the persecution by the Nazis. He was convinced that all those responsible, from senior officials to simple collaborators, should face justice. His tenacity earned him recognition, and from the 1960s, his name became synonymous with Nazi hunting. He was nominated 4 times for the Nobel Peace Prize, received a knighthood in the United Kingdom, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the United States, the Lion d'Honneur of France, and at least 53 additional recognitions. For many, Windhaupt became a kind of secular saint. He is credited with locating 1,100 Nazi criminals, but his legacy is questionable. Throughout his life, he invented stories and exaggerated his role in numerous captures from the end of World War II until his death in 2005. He gave inaccurate versions of his work in the persecution of the Nazis, invented false stories about his past during the conflict, and also distorted details about his academic training. Despite his ambiguous relationship with the truth, his contribution was key to bringing several war criminals to justice. His figure remains controversial, but his impact on the search for justice is undeniable. Nazis in exile. The refuge of war criminals in the Middle East in 1948. Only 3 years after the end of World War II, a notorious war criminal managed to escape from a prison in Linz, Austria. Stengel, who had commanded the extermination camps of Sur and Trinca, was responsible for the deaths of nearly 1 million Jews. His escape route took him through Graz, Murano, and Florence until he reached Rome, where Bishop Alois Hudel, also Austrian, welcomed him and provided him with false documentation that allowed him to travel to Syria, where he later reunited with his family. In 1951, the Stengels moved to Brazil, unaware that Stengel had opened a new escape route for the Nazis in the Middle East. Alois Brunner, one of the most ruthless executors of the Holocaust, was still at large at that time. During the conflict, Brunner held a high position in the Gusto, being the main collaborator of Adolf Ammon and head of the Department of Jewish Affairs. His ability to organize mass deportations and murders in countries such as France, Greece, and Slovakia made him a key figure in the genocide. Eichen considered him his best agent. After the end of the war, he hid in Germany, but in 1954 he felt the authorities were cornering him, especially when a French court sentenced him to death in absentia. With the support of former allies, he followed in Stengel's footsteps and escaped to Egypt, then ruled by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Thus began his exile in the Middle East, which lasted until his death several decades later. Nasser hired several German experts in military and missile technology, as well as some strategists and security specialists. However, he had no interest in figures like Brunner, whose only experience was extermination with the help of Amin al-Husseini, the former Mufti of Jerusalem and protector of the Nazis in the region. Brunner managed to reach Syria, where he obtained a work visa in 1955. He joined an increasingly large group of arms dealers in Damascus, the Syrian capital, where he joined other fugitive Nazis, such as Franz Rameke, a former official of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Third Reich, and Wilhelm Bisner, a German spy in charge of eliminating the Jewish population of Palestine if Germany had won the war. Together, they founded the Orient Trading Company, a company that actually served as cover for a lucrative arms trafficking business. His network obtained weapons from the Communist bloc and supplied them to the Algerian resistance, the National Liberation Front, in its fight against the French occupation. Brunner amassed a great fortune with this activity, but in 1959 his luck began to fail. Unbeknownst to him, Syrian agents were already following his movements and did not look favorably on his operations. In late 1959, Syrian authorities arrested Brunner and transferred him to a secret facility where prisoners of war were interrogated and tortured. Suspecting that he was an undercover agent, they accused him of drug trafficking and ordered him to remain in custody until his situation was clarified. Faced with death, Brunner made a last attempt to save himself. He assured the officers that he was persecuted for his role in fighting the Jewish people. The reaction of the officer in charge changed immediately. He stood and offered him a handshake. "Welcome to Syria," he told him. "The enemy of my enemies is my ally." From then on, he began collaborating with the Syrian government on various tasks during the 80s and 90s. Damascus continued to provide him refuge, ignoring multiple extradition requests from Austria, West Germany, and the United States. Each official response was the same: that person was not in Syria. However, media pressure from Nazi Hunter Surge and Beta Klarfeld made his presence in the capital a problem. Over time, his usefulness to the government diminished. Brunner's movements became restricted, especially after he ignored the president's direct orders to keep a low profile. Despite the warnings, he gave interviews to German, Austrian, and international media, causing discomfort in the highest circles of power. Finally, in 1996, the Syrian government decided to get rid of him. They took him from his residence and locked him in an underground cell at the Muhajirun police station. The door closed, never to be opened again. Brunner spent the rest of his life in deplorable conditions, surrounded by dirt and neglect. It is believed he died in 2010. Lake Justice, the persecution of Nazis in the 21st century. People like Vintel and Bauer never ceased their mission for decades and managed to bring thousands of those responsible for the Holocaust and their accomplices to justice. However, due to the passage of time, capturing war criminals has become a race against time, even though those who were very young during World War II are now over 90 years old. A clear example is the case of Johann Rogan, who, in 2018 at the age of 94, was identified as a former guard at the Stav concentration camp, where he served between 1942 and 1944. As he had not turned 21 when the event occurred, he was tried in a juvenile court in Minster and charged with the deaths of over 100 Polish prisoners and 77 Soviet soldiers using Zombie gas. Another similar case occurred in 2019, when Bruno Day, at 93, received a sentence for his complicity in the murder of more than 5,000 people in an extermination camp between 1944 and 1945. The location and prosecution of these people has been possible thanks to a specialized team that operates in the German city of Ludwigsburg in the southwest of the country. There, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes has operated since 1958. Its task is to locate the last perpetrators of the Holocaust who have not been tried and who can still be tried. Each year, the prosecutors of this institution identify about 30 suspects still alive. Subsequently, the cases are transferred to regional prosecutors, who spend about 1 year determining whether the evidence is sufficient to start a trial. Since the start of the 21st century, this meticulous process has led to 6 trials, including the cases mentioned above. Currently, the minimum age of the accused is around 90 years, and most held lower-ranking positions within the Nazi regime: guards, kitchen staff, doctors, and communications operators. The problem is that many of those involved die before their trials conclude, which reduces the chance of obtaining convictions. In 2013, for example, the Central Office drew up a list of 30 people who had worked in Schwitz and could be tried immediately. However, only 5 faced justice. as the others died before appearing or were considered unfit for trial. Despite this, the importance of this institution does not lie in the number of sentences handed down, but in the message it conveys. No crime against humanity will be forgotten thanks to its work. Those who participated in the horrors of narcissism must live knowing that at any moment justice can reach them. Its existence keeps alive the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and reminds the world of the magnitude of the atrocities committed between 1933 and 1945. The story of these crimes is so chilling that it is imperative not to let it fall into oblivion, even as many decades pass. The end of World War II marked the fall of Nazism, but did not end the search for justice. For decades, the escape networks, the complicity of various institutions, and the efforts of those who persecuted war criminals were revealed. Some found refuge in South America, the Middle East, or even Europe, protected by regimes that welcomed them for strategic interests. Others were captured and tried. However, many never faced consequences, and with time, the possibility of prosecuting them diminished. However, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Germany has continued its work, demonstrating that justice does not end for crimes against humanity. This account is not just history, but a warning about the importance of memory. The atrocities committed by the SS must not be forgotten, and impunity cannot be acceptable. Even though the years pass, history remembers their names, their acts, and the consequences of their ideology. Justice, although late, is still necessary to honor the victims and reaffirm humanity's commitment to truth.